Thanks everyone for attending. I'm not sure if we're going to have some of the same faces as last week or some welcome new people as well. So my name is Heather Stewart. I work as a biodiversity officer at Cardinia Shire. Cardinia Shire acknowledges that we are on the traditional lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people. We pay their respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Thank you for attending our second Gardens Wildlife Workshop tonight. Tonight we will be learning about how to attract small birds to your garden and help keep them safe and give them a home. Gardens Wildlife is a free program for Cardinia Shire residents, showing you how to create gardens that attract wildlife and improve their habitat. Due to COVID restrictions, we've had to move our program online, and we thought it was a good time to trial some of these online workshops and see what people thought of them. The program is a partnership between Cardinia Shire Council, land care groups, friends groups and volunteers. If you complete tonight's workshop, you will be sent a link to register for a free plant voucher valued at $20 for the Cardinia Environment Coalition Nursery at Deep Creek Reserve. The nursery will be open from the 30th of April 2021, so very soon, and will be the home of the Gardens Wildlife Project. The Deep Creek Reserve is Council's premier environmental site. It has a natural playground, wetlands, a cafe, golf club, and now an Indigenous plant nursery. So you can plan a day out with your friends and family and start your wildlife gardening adventure at the nursery. I would like to introduce you to our presenter, Richard Rowe from Sustainable Gardening Australia. He will guide us through tonight's presentation, and I will be staying to answer questions. So I encourage you to grab a cup of tea or a drink of water or whatever you think of, and we'll settle in for the next hour and talk small birds, which is super fun. Thanks, everyone.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Heather. So yes, my name's Richard from Sustainable Gardening Australia, and just to let you know, the background that I come from, or the perspective I come from, is from the gardener's perspective. So I won't necessarily know all of the answers, but hopefully tonight, through the questions, we might be able to answer some of the things that you're curious about or don't quite understand from the talk tonight. So let me start. I'm just going to share my screen, and we're going to go through, here we go, this presentation on attracting small birds to your garden. Really important thing to do. The small birds are a lot rarer now than they used to be, and so we'll talk about some of the reasons for that and things that we can do in our garden to help support them and hopefully encourage them back into our gardens. Now, when you've logged on tonight, your cameras and your microphones have been turned off, but you'll notice that there's a Q&A button and a chat button there. So if you've got questions through the night, through the next hour, make sure you type them into the Q&A section. Heather will be there keeping an eye on them, and we'll stop every now and again and answer some of those questions. There's also a chat button there. So if you've got any observations that you've made of birds or resources you'd like to share or just general comments, you can throw those into the chat area as well. There was a recording of this being made tonight, and notes will be distributed as well. And so that will be coming out in the next few days or so. So there's no need to take lots of notes of your own. Now, just very quickly on Sustainable Gardening Australia. So we're a non-for-profit organisation, and what we do is we encourage people to do really good things in their garden that help the natural environment, which is things like we're talking about tonight, is encouraging biodiversity and supporting biodiversity. Also, we have a lot of information about growing food and veggie gardening in the home garden, and things around building community. And you can find out more about us on our website, sgaonline.org.au, through our social media. And while you're on our website, if you wanted to engage or to subscribe to our monthly newsletter called Cuttings, you can do that from the website as well. We've also got a Friends of SGA, or FOSCA as we call it for short. And this group is about helping us to do the things that we continually think we need to be doing. So with a small financial contribution, which helps us continue on our non-for-profit work. So it's $25 per year. You get access to an additional newsletter called Flourish. You'll get discounts from some of our business supporters, some seeds and plant, for example, supporters. You can see there on the right-hand side. And also discounts to a couple of other things like our masterclasses. So there's a whole range of masterclasses coming up on our website. So again, you can find out more about our masterclasses and also our Friends of group on SGA Online. But what we're here to talk to tonight about is small birds. And so the first one I just want to highlight is one of my favourite small birds, and I have lots of memories being up in the country in northern Victoria and seeing these beautiful, superb fairy wrens. So I'm just going to play the whistle or the song. So hopefully in the background you can hear the song there. So beautiful little song there. And as I said, often with a lot of small birds, you mightn't get to see them, but you might get to hear them. Now, the fairy wren is one that is quite active and quite extrovert, and it actually will come out and sort of move around a fair bit. And I understand that there are the superb fairy wrens in your area, and I might be wrong, but I've got a feeling that the fairy wren is actually one of the mascot for the Gardens for Wildlife. So maybe Heather can confirm that at some stage.
Yes, it is. It was voted the most popular bird by all of our Gardens for Wildlife volunteers.
Beautiful.
I think
Excellent.
maybe it's because of its cheeky nature. I
It
found them
is.
to be quite a cheeky species.
They're very cheeky and extroverted, which is unusual for a lot of small birds. Yeah. So often you'll see a male bird which has all those beautiful cobalt blue colours in its feathers, and then a whole lot of different Jenny wrens and family, I suppose, and they all sort of hang around together. Very small, so about 14 centimetres in size and about 10 grams in weight. Now, to put that in some sort of context, that's about the weight of a 20-cent piece. So you can actually start to see how small and light these little birds are. Seen in a lot of habitat types, but prefer that dense covering with lots of low shrubs so that they come out and they can do some foraging and then they can go back into those dense shrubs. And so they're often common in our parks and gardens when we're lucky enough to see them as well. They love insects and other little arthropods and grasshoppers especially. So this gives you a bit of an idea of some of the types of things you might have to encourage in your garden to be able to encourage these sorts of birds. So you need to have lots of insects in your garden. So think about that as what might be missing in your garden to encourage insects. Feeding mostly on the ground, but also from low shrubs as well. And then there's some trees there or bushes like sweet basaria, hakeas and wattles that will attract a lot of insects and therefore potentially attract these sort of birds as well. Nesting in a dome structure that they make out of grasses. So that's about thinking about what nesting materials are required. So having lots of native grasses is a very good thing to have for nesting materials. Usually placed in some sort of low bush, and it needs to be fairly well protected as well. So that's one of the little birds that you'd hopefully be attracting through some of the ideas that we'll give you tonight. So what I want you to do now is imagine that you are a small bird, and in the chat, I'd like you to put down a couple of words about how you would describe yourself, your personality. We've already talked about some of these already. Your characteristics, your behaviours, your likes or dislikes. So maybe just in the chat, just throw a few things down that you think when you think of a small bird, because what we're then going to have a think about is, well, what sort of things in our garden do we need and what sort of things are missing? So let me just see what's in there. Just write a few words down in there, see what we've got. Timid. Yeah, so unlike the wren, the superb fairy wren, a lot of them are very timid. And they like, as we've got there, that prickly habitat. So they're also quite, they're timid, but they're quite skitty and very fast to escape. Okay, so they need places that are going to protect them. So let's move on to the next slide, and we won't necessarily ask for a lot of input on this one, but given the nature of what the characteristics of the birds are, so they're shy, they're are on the ground, they like to be protected, and what are the sort of things that they might need in your garden? So does your garden complement the behaviours and the characteristics of these small birds and the needs of these small birds? And so through tonight, I'd like you to think about your garden and start thinking about what some of the gaps are if you want to get these small birds into your garden. So then you can start thinking about what you need to build into it, what additional plants you might need to put, or other structures you might need to have in your garden. So hopefully if you come away from tonight with a few ideas, then we've had a good evening. So why are we interested in birds? Well, here is some graphs of the endangered or vulnerable, near threatened, critically endangered animals in Victoria. And as you can see, birds form a very large part of this. So on the vulnerable, near vulnerable, 46%, or about 87 of the birds in Victoria, and about 41 or 31% of the critically endangered or endangered. Now, I went onto a website called a government website where you can actually look at your local government area and see what birds are in these threat categories. And I've just picked out a few here. There was quite a few within the Cardinia area. But as you can see, often they are some of the smaller ones as well. So the small honey eaters and the little parrots. There's the painted snipe, or some water birds as well, obviously in there, and some bigger ones like the grey falcons. But there is quite a large range of birds within Cardinia that are either critical, endangered, or vulnerable. And so we need to think about what we can do to support these in our own gardens. Now, what we've found over time is that larger birds have adapted really well to the way that we've built our cities and our towns. And so because they have adapted very well, they've come to dominate. And some of these are still some of the very classic Australian birds, like the magpies and the wattlebirds and the, kookaburras. And they're beautiful birds to see around. The butcherbird there as well. But things are getting a little bit out of balance. So some research by Birds in Backyards was showing that in bushland, these larger type of birds usually represent about 10% of the species if you go into more of a native bushland, undisturbed bushland area. But in our cities and larger towns, it's 30%, if not higher. And so you can see that compared to a natural environment and our urban environments, the larger birds have a bigger population. And then on the other side of things, the smaller birds have a lot more negative impacts from the way we've built our cities. So again, the same research, in bushland, these small birds represent about 40% of the species that were found by weight. So that was for those really small birds, less than 15 grams. And in cities, it's only 15%. Okay, so again, you can see there's a lot more larger birds and a lot less of these smaller birds. So let's have a think about why some of that's happened. And there's a few reasons. As I mentioned, our larger birds have increased because they've adapted to our urban landscapes really well, and our gardens and our parks and so on. So they're also much more adapted to eating some of our food waste that can be left hanging around near bins and so on. And so they actually breed up to the level of food that's around. Some of these larger birds, because they've adapted well, but they are also threats to some of the smaller birds. So they are predators to some of the smaller birds. So you get more larger birds, then there's going to be more pressure on the smaller birds. And some of the ones that we're talking about in these categories are things like the currawongs, magpies, ravens, butcherbirds, kookaburras. Some of the beautiful iconic ones birds are actually are a more aggressive or a carnivore, for example, type of bird. And so, because our garden structures don't support the small birds as well, they're actually becoming larger birds much more dominant. Now, here's a couple of pictures, and have a look at the differences between these two pictures. And think in your mind, if I was a small bird, which one would I prefer? So gardens or public spaces that have lots of lawn, like the picture on the left, are not the favoured haunts of our small birds. That is the areas, they're the types of landscapes and gardens that the larger birds prefer, where they can swoop down, where they can hunt, and they can fly around quite freely. Whereas our smaller birds like the structures on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, where it's much more dense. There's no lawn in there, more dense. It's easier for them to find food and also to find protection and shelter. So again, think about your garden and have a little bit of a think about which side of those two pictures. And usually we hopefully will be somewhere in the middle, but we need to start thinking a little bit more towards building some of that structure that's on the right-hand side. Now, even with some of the medium-sized birds, there is actually quite a lot of what I call bully birds. So these are ones that have a very dominating behaviour and characteristics. Things like the noisy and the Indian miner. So the noisy miner, the one on the left, the grey one, is actually a native bird, but it can become quite bossy and territorial. And then the Indian miner, the second one there on the left, that is the more browny one. That is an introduced miner, and it is becoming much more of a pest bird, but is very aggressive. Very smart birds, but very aggressive as well. Even small birds like the bell miner, which you can hear sometimes, that bell sound can be very aggressive. And obviously things like the magpies and the wattlebirds can also be quite territorial in their ownership of space, I suppose, and chase out the smaller birds. Family pets and the introduction of what have become feral animals are also a big issue. A lot of our small birds, not all of them, but a lot of them feed on the ground, and so they are very vulnerable. And so we'll talk a little bit about how we can make sure, we'll try and, if we've got pets, the things that we can do to try and reduce the risk of them predating on the small birds. But certainly foxes and feral cats and even dogs will definitely predate on small birds. Okay, here is another one. This is the brown thornbill. So it's not as showy as the fairy wren, but let's just listen to the call here. Now, apparently, the thornbill is a very good imitator as well, a mimic. So it actually, apart from its normal musical warbles, it can actually mimic other sort of sounds. So sometimes it might be a bit hard to pick out. But apparently it also can respond quite well to human calls as a result of that. So if you hear one, you might be able to make some other types of whistles and calls, and it might respond to you likewise. Now, this one's even smaller, so 7 grams. So that is a tiny, tiny little bird, tiny bird. Again, the types of habitat it likes, and we're talking about the dense shrubby habitats. Lots of leaf litter and mulch on the ground, on the garden floor is really important to encourage the insects that it will be looking for. So think about your own garden. Are you encouraging those insects in your garden? So it is mainly an insect eater, but it will also eat seeds and nectar and fruit. So it will generally graze. And a lot of these birds, while they do have a preference for some for seeds, some for insects, some for nectar and fruit, they often do graze across those different food types. But definitely this is an insect lover. In that understory of shrubs and low trees, so not too high up off the ground. They have pairing, they do pair in quite long-lasting couples. So one of these birds that basically forms a bond with their partner. And a small domed-like nest with a hooded entrance. So a very different type of nest there as well. And again, grasses, bark, and other materials. Now we'll go into some of the sort of the building materials a little bit later, but that's another little one that you might see around. So that gets to some of the questions about what you can do. So these are some of the things that we're going to go through. It's about your soil. It's about researching your fauna and flora in your area and seeing what's around and trying to replicate that and start trying to learn from it. We'll talk about the structure of your garden and Indigenous plants, a little bit about chemical use and how we've got to try and reduce it. As I mentioned, we'll talk about pets. I will cover off on supplementary bird food and the conditions that favour some of those aggressive birds that we've talked about, those open gardens. If we get time, we'll quickly talk about netting for for fruit trees. It's really important that you also listen and watch and engage with your gardens and your local reserves, and really start learning about what sort of birds and other animals are in there as well. So here we have a little picture of an ecosystem. And what's
Richard,
really...
we've got
yeah.
a question. I was wondering when we were going to take a pause for questions.
Yeah, that's right. We could do that now.
We've just one question that we have had in quite early on in the piece is, does council have any plan to omit property fencing and to plant prickly plants instead? If everyone joins in, it will create pretty good habitat corridor. I would say, as the council person, I would agree that sounds like a brilliant plan. We currently don't have anything, to my knowledge, that's underway to enable that. We ask people to plant prickly dense plants in the Bunyip, Garfield and Tynong railway townships for bandicoots, but not specifically for birds. So that's obviously a fabulous idea, but one that we haven't enacted yet. So I don't know if that answers that question. But we've only got one question through so far, so keep filtering them through as you see fit.
Yeah, that's great. And look, even if you're planting them for the bandicoots, as an example, those resources are therefore now available for the small birds as well. And so, there are multiple benefits and beneficiaries to any of these gardens, in any of our gardens, that we start to build out with additional density of wildlife and vegetation. So there's lots of benefits. And part of the reason why is, if you have a look at this little pyramid, so we've got the soil on the bottom, and then we've got the plants at the next level, and then we've got different levels of wildlife. So primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. The primary are feeding directly off the plants, so they're like the vegetarians. And then you've got the secondary consumers, which are a bit more omnivores and then you've got the carnivores up the top. Now, what you can see with birds is that they inhabit the three different areas. And so over time, they've evolved to feed off all of these different food sources. So by introducing more plants, you're going to get lots of different types of birds, but then you'll also have lots of insects, which will encourage lots of the insectivore type birds. And the more density in life that you get within your garden, so your garden should be a little bit like a mini version of this ecosystem, then you'll also get the more predatory birds coming along as well. The problem is when we actually lose some of these levels. So often we don't have these secondary consumers and not as many of these primary consumers, but we've got a lot of the predator ones up the top. And so the whole system gets a little bit out of balance. So we're going to briefly talk about soil and how important it is to start in our soil, because basically all of this structure is supported by the health of our soil. So the characteristics of a healthy soil is we've got this little pie graph here. And so we've got almost half of it is solid, either mineral particles, which are clay, silt and sand, and a bit of organic matter. And that's a really important element. This is if we get ourselves hands dirty or our clothes dirty. This is really the part we're talking about, but that's not what soil is. Soil is more than just these solid particles. It's also the air and the water that's able to reside within our soil. So our soil should have lots of gaps and voids. And the water and the air swings between, depending on whether it's dry or wet. And this is a really critical part of a healthy soil. So a healthy soil enables our roots to explore nice and deep. And therefore we get much stronger plants, better adjusted for climate change, better adjusted for drier periods because they have deeper roots. And this soil, because it's got this void in it, enables water to move through it so much better. It gets stored for longer, it moves quicker, and it gets released into our plants. And so having these gaps enables the water, and therefore the next one, the air, to balance themselves out. And so you've got this air exchange as well, where the carbon dioxide from all the creatures that live in the soil gets exchanged with oxygen. And so that's why we need the voids. And then that is all supporting all of this life. We've got some organic matter in there, in that soil, and then that becomes the habitat. So all of that becomes the habitat for all this soil life, this soil food web. And that's what we need to try and encourage to have a healthy garden. And that soil food web is made up of all sorts of organisms. Some are so small we can't see.
Oh, sorry.
That's right. Go ahead. You there, Heather?
Oh, I was just jumping in there. We've got a fair few questions
Okay.
about
Yep.
the triangle that we saw a few slides back with the different types of birds.
Yep.
So the first question we've got is, what about cockatoos? Where do they fit in? We have a lot of cockatoos in the Shire, particularly up in the hills.
Yes, and I've really picked out some of the smaller ones here. So the cockatoos, from what I understand, would be more in this side, in the primary consumer. So they're more looking at and destroying, I have to say sometimes as well, some of those bigger parrots can be quite destructive at the resources from our gardens. And so they'd be more looking for seeds and grains and things like that. Yeah. So often you see the really big ones you'll see in like the she oaks. They're looking for, and the pine trees, they're looking for those really large sort of like pine cones and little she oak cones and things.
The next question's about cockatoos as well. So I would love to know if there's anything that we can do to deter cockatoos/crows. I've noticed an increase since getting chickens and worried that they are scaring my little birds away.
Yes, potentially. Interesting you see when you've got chickens. I'm not quite sure the correlation there, unless it's an open pen and
Bird
they're able
food,
to.
maybe it's
Yeah,
the
they're able
bird
to
food,
get
the
in.
seed.
Yeah, so I've got chickens, and I used to get a lot of, not necessarily cockatoos, but a lot of birds coming in and trying to steal all the food. So I've now put some chicken wire over the top of my chicken coop. So it basically keeps out all of those birds trying to eat all of the food that I give the chicken. So that's one option there, because if they're using that as a food source, you need to try and deny them that, and that might help balance it out. They are, and cockatoos and corellas and so on can come in sort of plague proportions at time. So they can be very, very hard to try and manage.
And so the next question we've got is it possible to turn around the balance of the triangle? So we've got bigger territorial birds, and this person has a family of magpies in their gardens. They're looking to turn around the balance of bigger territorial birds as their garden develops.
Yep.
And then a response to that is, if you have seen birds of all levels but recently seen changes to carnivores, what would you suggest? So I think people are seeing changes to the different ratios of different birds.
Yeah, and look, that can be seasonal as well, and it can be certain factors that are bringing it in. But again, it's going to come down to garden structure to some degree, and so we will get into how we can build out our garden structure. So those bigger birds, and look, having those bigger birds is great. I've got ravens, I've got butcher birds, I've got occasional owls, kookaburra. I've got them all in my garden, but it's about when they become dominant. And sometimes in breeding season, you might see a lot more of the, for example, the kookaburras or the magpies. And at this time of the year, I'm seeing king parrots, which are sort of getting into my tomatoes and stuff. But other times of the year, I won't see them. So it can be seasonal, but it can also be garden structure. And so we'll get into some of the things you can do on garden structure. Okay, is that enough? We'll keep going?
Yeah, let's keep going.
Beautiful. So our soil, there's lots of life in our soil, and it's made up of all sorts of different creatures. Some are so small, like bacteria and fungi, that we can't see them, and then there's a whole lot of predation going on. And basically what the soil is doing, all this life that's living in that habitat that is our soil, is it's recycling all of the organic matter that comes down into it and making that available back into our plants so that plants can grow strong and healthy. So to encourage this soil food web in our soil, it's about, and this is just because we covered this a little bit last week, but just to really cover off again, it's about adding organic matter, lots of mulch and so on on your soil, and in your veggie garden, you might add in a lot more compost and so on. It's also about trying to minimize the use of harsh chemicals, whether it's fertilizer, insecticides, because the harsh ones, like the real chemical-based ones or manufactured ones, can really not just impact above the soil, but it can impact the health of the soil food web as well. So the extent that we can reduce that, then that's a positive. As I mentioned, mulching, and so organic matter comes into this in so many different ways, into sustainable gardening, but mulching, really important. Helps keep moisture retention, which these creatures in our soil need moisture, just like our plants do. We need to reduce our digging, because every time we dig, we expose our soil to ultraviolet light, and that can have impacts, and we also disrupt all of these voids that have been made and destroy some of the life in the soil. Avoid compaction, so when we stand on our soil, we again reduce all of these voids, these holes in our soil where the water and the air go. And so that again impacts both the plants and the life in our soil. Avoid erosion. So always have something covering your soil like plants or mulch. And again, just to summarize it all, add organic matter, one of the key things that you can do, because that's what nature does. That's how nature feeds the soil food web. It drops its leaves and the animals drop their manure and everything onto the soil, and it gets recycled, and that's what encourages it. So here we are with another little cute one, and I have to admit, I have not seen a spotted parletlet around my garden. So this is one I'd love to see. Let me just put the whistle on. So it's a very recognizable call. It's like a 3-note call, one lower and then a couple of higher notes. So it's quite easy to recognize that one. It's one of our smallest birds at 9 centimeters or about 8 grams. So we're talking tiny. Again, usually found in pairs, and it's got some beautiful colors to it and little spots on it. And now this one actually doesn't necessarily live just on the ground. So this one likes our big flowering eucalypts. And so we'll go around through the flowering eucalypts looking for insects and other little critters that are living on our leaves, and any of those sugary exudates or sort of saps and things that come from the leaves. And so it will actually be up in our the canopy side of our garden or our parks. Now, it's also an interesting small little bird because it's one of the few that you can actually build or have a nesting box for. So in the bush, it will actually look for a little tunnel and build a little nest in a tunnel in the side of a creek, in the banks or in cliffs and things like that. And so you can actually create a little nesting box. So there are some good designs on the website, birdlife.org and Birds in Backyards. And so you can see it's got this little tube at the front of it, and that's like going through the tunnel into the in the creek bank or so on. And so this is one you can actually put up in your trees. And so it's a beautiful little bird. If you had them around you, putting in some nesting resources would be a very positive thing to be able to do. So like all of our wildlife gardening, there's 4 key things that you need to add into your garden or see what's missing from your garden. And it's about food, water, shelter, and nesting sites and resources. And not just for the birds, but think about their food supply. So again, think about the insects that a lot of our little birds eat. So what are the resources for food and water, shelter, and nesting that they need as well? And then you're building out that ecosystem. So we'll just go through those very quickly. Food, it's pretty clear that this is where our gardens come to the front. It's nectar, pollen, seeds, fruit, leaves, insects. But also there's that next level of the food chain. It's the frogs and little reptiles and other little animals as well, that not the small birds won't eat, but some of the larger birds will. And they are all there because of your garden plants again. So you can see how our garden structures and our garden plants become really important for our wildlife garden. And in your notes, there'll be a list of plants that to attract insects, and would be these sort of things like acacias and daisies and everlastings and hardenbergias and melaleucas and stuff like that. For lollyshops, so these are for the birds that like their nectar. things like correas and banksias and grevilleas and callistemons are great. For birds that love their seeds, acacias, casuarinas, lots of native grasses and sedges and so on. And then there's the fruit shop. So there's the ones that like their fruit, things native dianellas, ruby salt bushes, raspberries, native raspberries, that is, prickly currant bush. So these will all be listed in your handout notes if you wanted to build out. So think about your garden and think about, do I have some of each of these? If you just had grevilleas, for example, you'd be attracting a lot of the larger birds, and potentially a lot of the larger birds that are a little bit more aggressive and territorial. So you need to build this diversity into your garden to attract a diversity of birds. Water is another really important element that we often don't think about, but it's especially critical in our warmer months, especially if we're going through droughts. So ponds, rock pools, or bird baths are really important resources to have in our garden. Now, bird baths are an interesting one because they're they provide an important resource. You can put them on the ground, but if they're on the ground, then the birds are more susceptible to be predated upon by foxes or dogs or cats. So then you can think about, well, I could put them up in the air a little bit. So you can do them on a pillar, or you could have them hanging from a tree somewhere. So there's some of the options that gives them a little bit of a better chance of making a quick escape if they need to. So a couple of tips with bird baths though. Keep them clean regularly, fresh water with no detergents if possible. Part of the reason for this is that bird baths and feeding stations, if you were to have one, become a communal spot, a very social spot. And so any communal diseases or parasites that birds might have can easily get shared amongst the different species at these communal points of water. So it's important to try and keep them clean. And so these are not necessarily diseases that won't be diseases that will pass on to humans, but are around the different species of birds like beak and feather and so on. Put them in dappled shade if you can. If it's too hot and sunny and water gets too hot, they're not necessarily going to be attracted to it. A relatively shallow dish is good. And if you have one that's a bit deeper, put some pebbles or rocks in the bottom, or even a little branch or stick, so that they've got something they can stand on and then just reach down into the surface of the water. And have them so they're relatively exposed so they can actually see an approaching danger and make that quick escape. So definitely think about some water in your garden if you don't already have some, but then also just think about some of the vulnerabilities that can expose a bird to a small bird, and then make sure that you try and negate some of those risks for them. And then the last one was, or not the second last one, was shelter. So again, this is your gardens. This is the dense and bushy, prickly type bushes for the small birds. For some of the other birds, it's the tree canopies. Other birds will need hollows to shelter in. A lot of small birds like the native grasses. And so, we'll talk about a little bit more about how to design a small bird garden shortly. But again, it's those prickly acacias and hakeas, the sweet basarias, litostrums, and those sort of plants that are very good in providing that sort of density for the small birds. And then, so again, it's our garden, nesting resources, either locations or the materials for them. So the locations is they need trees, but the small birds is the dense and the prickly bushes. Thickets or hedgerows. So if you've got if you've got a really windy spot and you want to try and build a hedge in there, so to stop the wind coming through, then build one with those dense prickly bushes, and then you'll be able to actually provide a lot of habitat. So this is about getting lots of benefits out of the one design choice. We'll talk briefly about tree hollows and nesting boxes as well. But then it's not just about having these locations, but it's about the building materials. So it's about the resources that the birds need to actually make the nests. So grasses and twigs and leaf litter, feathers, and even spiders' webs. Many birds actually use spiders' webs to glue their webs together, their nests together. So having lots of spiders in the garden provides lots of resources.
So we've got a few more questions, Richard, if this is a good time.
Yep. That's good.
We've got a vote for organic matters. So just reinforcing how
Yep.
important organic matter is.
Yep.
The next question we've got is that blackbirds thrive in a mulched environment.
They
What
do.
impacts do these birds have on small birds? And if they are significant, how do we eliminate blackbirds?
A really good answer. And I actually can't know. I don't fully know the answer. So if anybody does online, maybe they could throw that in as a part of the answer. I do know that blackbirds do like to scrounge around and move the mulch, and really can make a big mess in a garden as well. So they're looking again for those low resources and the insects and so on. And so I don't know the answer of how to stop them coming along. So I'm not sure whether other people can. It's about having those resources for all the birds. And it's a bit like this building station that I'm talking about. If you have, if you have a material station as an observatory point or an observation point in your garden, you can't determine or you can't dictate which birds will come along and visit. So you will get some of the annoying birds and the pesty birds, but hopefully you'll also provide resources for some of the more timid ones as well.
The next question is, do you come out and check people's gardens for advice? And
No, I
at the moment,
don't.
unfortunately, the answer is no. We used to have garden
Yep.
visits run by
Yep.
our fabulous garden guides, and each township had a different volunteer friends group or land care group that would come and assess people's gardens. At this point in time, we've been told we have to suspend our on-site garden visits, which is why we have these live webinars. What I could suggest to people is to take lots of pictures of your garden and to bring it down to the Cardinia Environment Coalition nursery at Deep Creek when it opens. And they will have plenty of plants, resources, and volunteers on hand to talk you through your garden and what you might like to do with your design choices.
Yep.
Apart from that, in this current climate, unfortunately, it would be engaging a landscape designer, right. And that would be a paid service. Something that council.
Yeah, and doing a little bit of research yourself. So I do. I'm not sure if I've got in this one, but there's a book by A.B. Bishop called Habitat, which was put out about 2 years ago, I think it is, which is a great resource to get ideas on what you can do. So look for some of those sorts of resources as well.
So the next one, here's a great question. What is the guide on a ratio of nest plants quantities to food plant quantities? Like, do you want 70% prickly bushes and 30% nectar plants, or how do you know what percentage to get?
Well, I don't know if there's any magical formula. It's really about diversity is the key, because in nature there is diversity. Because what is a food plant is also a nesting resource that is also a shelter resource. So they don't actually necessarily provide one of those services. They will provide many. But I do have a little bit of a sample design for a small bird garden that we can have a look at shortly, and that might help just answer that a little bit further as well.
And the last question we've got is, more a statement, is that shelter is super important for escaped domestic birds too. So this person takes in stray budgies and canaries that have survived in the wild for several days. So
yep.
I guess the shelter plants are important for a range of different birds.
Absolutely, and also the water. I know we rescued a bird that can't even remember the name of it, and we found it on our in a drought area, a really hot day, and it was on our clothesline. So we adopted it because none of our neighbours knew of it, and its name was Peg. But yeah, having water resources as well for those birds was really important.
So Kirsty's asking for the name of the place that we mentioned that we could take the photos to and obtain the plants. So that's the Cardinia Environment Coalition nursery that is set up and will be opened on the 30th of April at Deep Creek Reserve. So I think, have you got the slide, Richard, later on that goes through the nurseries again?
No, I don't have that in this one.
I'll send it all to all participants then.
Yep, that'd be great. Or you can put it in the chat.
Absolutely.
Cool. Okie doke. So yeah, nesting resources. So your garden itself should be the primary source of nesting materials. So it's the twigs and leaves and bark and moss and all that sort of stuff. But you can also create a little station that provides, that if you can easily see it, a nice little observation point where you can actually see what's around as well. And so it's just a little cage or something that hangs from a tree or something like that you can put twigs and leaves and bark and moss and coconut core, a bit of natural wool, natural from a sheep. Even spiders' webs and so on. And so that picture down on the bottom is actually one that's hanging from my grapevine. And I put it up last year. It's got coconut fibre in it this time, what you can see there. And it basically all got used by a whole range of birds. None of them are the small birds, but then it wasn't in a place where a lot of small birds would have come. It was right near our kitchen. But we did get butcher birds and all sorts of other birds coming along and taking some resources. So not a primary source of materials, but a great little observation or a place to observe what's happening. Nesting boxes are really important for a whole range of our wildlife, including some of the larger birds and parrots. Really important resource because these spaces, these home or nesting spaces, are in short supply often in our urban environments because we cut down a lot of these older trees that have these natural hollows in them to build roads and houses and shopping centres and all of those sort of car parks and all those sort of things. So there is a lot of different designs. You can go buy some online. Some nurseries have them. You can make your own as well through a lot of online plans as well. Some of the smaller birds that still will use these are things like some of the smaller parrots and the pardalets that I mentioned. But as you can see from here, this bottom picture, they also need those resources to make a nest within the hollow. So it's not just about a place of a hollow or a substitute hollow, but it's about having those resources as well. This is where we get to why we're doing this in our garden. So here we have some wildlife corridors with a creek down on the left and a little bit of reserve in the middle and another corridor in the right. So these corridors is where we have some remnant vegetation and we have the animals all moving up and down. It's a bit like a highway for animals. But then there's these big spaces in between. And so our gardens and our wildlife gardens can become the linkage points where it provides points where the birds and other animals can actually move between these really important corridors and reserves. And so that's really important for their health, very important for their survival and their breeding, for example. And so this is where things like Gardens for Wildlife, and the more that the community can do this in their own gardens, creates more resources so that all of these animals, like our small birds, have options to be able to be moving around amongst their populations. So then we get to garden structure. Okay, not all of us can have a canopy tree, but sometimes we might have a canopy tree. Now, if you haven't and you've got the room, you can think about planting some canopy trees. Or it might be that you can see some canopy trees across the fence, like your fence line. And the reality is animals don't recognise our fence lines. So they're a human construct and they're things that we put in there, but the animals, if you can see a large canopy tree from your garden or your house, you can consider that as a part of your habitat or wildlife garden. Then we'll need to look at those more mid-story trees and larger shrubs. And this is where we can do a lot more in our garden. And so it's about building up this vertical structure. And think about your garden in 3 dimensions, not just in the horizontal, but the vertical plane. Then underneath that, we need to build out lots of understory. So lots of small shrubs and all of those sort of things that live, this is where we're starting to get more into those prickly bushes and all of those sort of things for these small birds. And the smaller your garden is, you can still do a lot of these sort of design options. Then we're looking at our ground covers. So this layer of ground covers and native grasses and all of those sort of things. We need to have a water element in there. And some rocks and logs and all of those sort of things for the plant, for the insects and for the birds as well, and lots of mulch. And then underneath that, we'll have our soil. So you can build up the structure of your garden in 3 dimensions and think about what layers are potentially missing in your garden. And so often we might have some of the big trees maybe a couple of shrubs, but we might be listing some of this more understories, some of the grasses and the small shrubs and the density around that. So maybe that's where we can add some more things into our garden. So some tips, as we've already mentioned, small birds like dense shrubs and prickly shrubs. Okay, dense shrubs and prickly ones. Those open lawn areas are a bit like a desert and a threat for small birds. So they will avoid big open grass areas. A little tip for you is when you have your plants and your density starting to build up, if you can get the chance to do some pruning after they're flowered, that will encourage additional density and growth rather than the plants over time becoming more spindly and leggy. By pruning off when you've had their flower flush, then that will actually help create a much denser bush. Mulching, again, really great thing to do for habitat and food for bugs and spiders and all those sort of things. Include some dead branches. So if you do have some branches that fall or some ones that are cut off, think about how you can actually build those into your garden and not get them taken away, because they perform a number of services, including shelter. As they rot down, they'll become food for invertebrates and so on and add to the soil, but also they're places where some birds might stand on and actually look for, to launch off to be able to find food. So they have lots of different roles. Mass plantings are really good. So rather than just having a daffodil here and something there, trying to have some density in your plantings and sequential flowering so that through the season, you've got some food resources, some seeds and some nectar happening around your garden. So there's always something there. The other thing is we can get very enthusiastic about our beautiful gardens and how we want to develop them. So have a big vision, but start small with lots of dense plantings and build it out from there and get it to be a point where you can sustain it and you can look after it. So definitely sometimes we go off and we'll plant the whole garden out, and then 2 years later it's got too much for us. So one suggestion is start small, build it out, get on top of it, make sure you can work with it, and then keep building it out from there. So I mentioned that here was going to be a sample structure. So this is a way of thinking about how you might structure a garden for small birds. So this is a corner garden. Okay, so you could do this as a circle, for example, but this one's actually based on being on a corner. So in the corner of the garden, so you've got the two fence lines there. This is what I call the sanctuary. So this is where we might have some of those tall, soft, dense shrubs, more feathery type of leaves, like callistemons and so on, but still quite dense. Then in front of that is where we might have a protective layer. So this becomes a bit of a boundary. So it becomes a boundary so the predatory birds or even the cats and things like that, for example, or dogs or foxes might not like to go through. Okay, so it's providing a boundary with some of these prickly bushes that then protects this sanctuary inside. Then in front of that, you'll start to have lots of ground covers and small shrubs and native grasses, things that are flowering for nectar or producing seed. You will also add into there some mulch. So have mulch all the way through it. So this is going to attract lots more, as it breaks down, it'll attract a lot more insects. And so that'll be good for all of the birds that like the insects as well. I would add some branches in here, which can become pouncing points, and that will break down as well. And just little logs and things like that, which will attract lots of insects as well. Then I would put a water source or something in here, something that is easily escapable into the prickly areas, something that's easily accessible for you to be able to clean it out, and therefore something that they can observe what's happening out here in the wider world of the cafe. So this is like the garden cafe. And so mightn't have directly answered of what's the percentage, but you can see it's about having a range of things and thinking about how you structure them a little bit so that you've got these different layers of resources that are coming into the garden. And these will be in your, again, in your list, your handouts, but just there's some examples of large prickly plants like the hakeas and sweet basarias and so on, the soft, dense shrubs like the grevilleas and the callistemons, the small shrubs, the ground covers and grasses, and obviously a nice coarse bark mulch. So they'll be in your handouts so you can have a look at some of the options there. I think I might skip the silver eye because we're sort of running out of time. Indigenous plants, really important. They thrive in your local environment, they suit your soil, and they have evolved with our birds and other animals. So it's a really important thing to be thinking about putting some Indigenous plants in. And as mentioned last week, there's the Indigenous Plant Guide, which is a great resource that you can use as well.
Richard, I also wanted to mention we've got the physical Indigenous plant guide, and we've also got an online version too,
Yep.
which actually has a lot more plant photos. You can get photos of each of the species flowers,
Yep.
and you can type your address into the website and it'll tell you what your plant zone is, and then it'll tell you a list of plants that are suited to your soil type.
Oh, awesome.
So
that's excellent. That's excellent. Really good.
Mm.
Beautiful. Just another tip in choosing plants. No, not all plants are the same. So you can get grevilleas like the moonlight here, which is a very popular one. Very large flowers. It flowers on the outside of the bush more. Quite an open plant. So it's more preferred by the larger birds, and they'll get a little, the wattle birds and so on. They'll get a little bit protective about it. Then you can get the grevilleas, which are much denser in their structure, and they're not as showy, but they have flowering all through the bush. And so they provide protection and still the nectar resources. And so look at the structure of even some of the plants. And so these ones have larger leaves and much bigger nodes or spaces between the leaves. These will have a lot smaller spaces between the leaves, so they'll be much denser in their structure. So look for some of the differences there that you can buy as well. Skip that one. Reducing chemical use, really important for a couple of reasons. We talked about it from a soil perspective, but it's also important from the animals perspective and the wildlife perspective, because a lot of our native birds, lizards and microbats and all sorts of things are predators to insects. So to the extent that we're poisoning out that layer of life with the insects, they're going to eat poisoned food, or there is going to be no food for them. So it's important that we try and reduce our use of especially insecticides in this particular occasion. And SGA does have a program or a database coming out in the next few months that will give you some better information on making wiser choices around using garden chemicals and alternatives. So keep an eye out on our website for that. Being a responsible pet owner is really important. Our pets, even though all our pets are perfect, they do have natural instincts to hunt. And so it's really important that we make sure we're obeying all the rules, that we fence off areas that are vulnerable, and we keep them under control. Now, cats particularly have a very strong hunting instinct. Even a domesticated cat can still exercise its hunting instinct even if it's not hungry. So think about trying to get your cat to be an indoor cat. A lot of people do have indoor cats. Desexing your cat can help reduce the amount of hunting instinct, but not remove it. Some people talk about a bell. They can move very carefully and not make the bell noise, but also a bell's not that much of an alert for some birds. There is some research that show that bright collars like these for birds that are light or colour sensitive give a much better warning. So you could look into making some nice bright coloured collars. Obviously, having that safer bird bath would be a good idea, and encourage your neighbours to be really careful with their cats as well. There are some resources. There's one that's put out by Zoos Vic and RSPCA called safecat.org.au. There's a brochure here that will be, the link will be in your handouts, which is to BirdLife, which is about cats and wildlife. And there is, we'll have a link as well in your handouts from Knox City Council, which has some good information around cat proofing, fencing and enclosures as well. So, think about how you might be able to help improve your wildlife garden if you do some different things with your cats, if you have them. Almost at the end, supplementary food for birds, we don't encourage it. It does a number of things. It creates a lot more dependence. Yes, it's an observation point for us, which is nice, but it creates a lot more dependence. It creates an unnatural diet, and often they're not a balanced diet. Again, it's this social place where diseases can be spread amongst birds. It's thought to maybe interrupt migratory behaviours in some birds. And when there's a lot of food, you get a breeding up of populations, and often it's of the pest populations, so the pigeons and so on. And if there's a lot of protective birds around, the larger birds will protect this area and scare out the smaller birds. It can also, if you've got too much of it, attract rats and so on. So there's lots of reasons why we suggest not using a supplementary feeding station. And that's why we would encourage building out the habitat and your vegetation in your garden to provide those food resources. And include a place for yourself in your garden so you can go out and watch them and observe them. Netting, also important, just to say this sort of netting that you can put your finger through, which was very common not that long ago, is now illegal. You need to use a much finer netting these days, and that was to try and stop birds and other animals getting caught up in it. If you want a bit more information on it, there is a website called Wildlife Friendly Fencing that you can go to, and I'll include that in the notes as well. And I'm going to skip that one because I know we're running out of time. Lots of citizen science opportunities. In the bird side, you've got BirdLife, you've got iNaturalist, eBird as well. So there's lots of different places that you can go and record your bird observations. And you can see, if you go onto these sites, you can actually see there's a database there that you can actually see what sort of birds are actually in your areas. So we'll do some more questions, but before we do that, I'll just give my recipe for a small bird habitat. So it's take a small plot of land and plan its habitat future. Spend some time contemplating about small birds and what they need. Sprinkle your soil with organic matter to power the soil food web. Add a layer of organic mulch for soil health and to encourage the insects and other invertebrates that small birds love to eat. Add clumps of dense and prickly shrubs for small birds to play, rest and nest. And add a dash of nectar plants as a lolly shop for the sweet tooth. Add a variety of native grasses for fine dining seed eaters. And add fruiting shrubs as a greengrocer for the frugivores. Splash your garden cafe with dense, open and long-flowering natives for insects. Mix well and apply water wisely. Add a safe source of fresh water for drinking and bathing, and make sure that there are natural materials for nest building. Install nest boxes, material stations, and insect hotels for a new generation. Manage introduced predators and wandering pets. Avoid supporting aggressive or larger birds. Stop using chemicals, and include a place for yourself to sit, observe, and enjoy. So we'll just see if there's any other questions there.
There's quite a few, Richard. I was waiting for a gap, so we'll get going with some of the questions.
Yep, absolutely.
Firstly, we've got, is council installing nest boxes in public reserves? I'll be quite honest with you, I don't know the answer entirely, so I'm happy to take it on notice. I know that we have a focus as a council on retaining old trees and retaining dead trees and doing what we call habitat pruning and habitat cutting. So cutting holes or fake hollows within trees, because they're a much more natural solution and a much easier solution to maintain than installing nest boxes. I know that the as part of the recovery program through the Bunyip fires, the Men's Shed and a group in Tynong have been installing a lot of nest boxes. But I guess as a first preference, we've been trying to create those habitat hollows within trees rather than relying on artificial nest boxes.
Yep.
So that would be my answer to that. Next question is, should we do a program in which people are to plant wildlife plants and take cuttings to the CEC nursery? They will get some sort of incentive, like 5 cents per cutting, which they could use to buy food. That's a great idea. I know that the CEC nursery predominantly regrows plants from seeds. So we tend to regrow most of the plants that we can from seeds in the Shire because it creates a lot more diversity. If everything's grown based on cuttings, what you're getting is a monoculture that's a lot more susceptible to disease. But I think that's a fabulous idea and not one I'd considered before. So the next question we've got is, how do we balance out having small scrub and undergrowth for birds, but becoming a habitat for predators like snakes? So maybe, Richard, you might have an answer to that one.
And this, yeah, I mean, and this is where nature does what nature does. I mean, natural predators are an important part of an effective ecosystem. So, you know, if you build out your habitat, your wildlife garden, you are going to potentially attract some of the predators, some of which you might be happy to see. You know, you might see a big owl or a wedge-tailed eagle flying by, which are natural predators of all sorts of things. But you can also attract things like snakes, and so they will be a predator for all sorts of things like frogs and lizards and all of that sort of stuff as well. So it's about understanding and showing respect. Snakes are just as scared of us, if not more scared of us. And so it's about making sure that we understand their behaviours so that we don't put ourselves into danger. And also using, when we do see them, as an opportunity to educate our kids of what role they play in the ecosystem, but also how we should behave around them. But also, we have to be careful, keeping doors shut and all that sort of stuff so we don't get them inside. But, we get snakes in dense city areas these days. So it's not something that is just unique to sort of peri-urban, urban and, country type of areas. It's everywhere that we will be seeing snakes.
Okay, the next question we've got is, someone's seeing cats as a problem, and what plants would you suggest to deter them?
What plants? Let me have a quick think about that. There is a book by Penny Woodward. I don't know if you know Penny, and I'm just trying to see if I've got it here, called Pest Repellent Plants. And let me just check on cats because I'd hate to misquote her. Cats 123. This is getting the resources at the tips of your fingers here.
Good on you.
Cats, rue and wormwood you could try. So they're quite smelly ones, and citronella type plants. So there's some of the sort of things that might distract them.
So we've got the next question is, does council monitor the counter birds in the Deep Creek Reserve since its construction? How has biodiversity improved? In short, our answer is no. We've had COVID for the better part of a year, and we were having school groups in to do all sorts of monitoring at the site, but a lot of that's been put on hold, and unfortunately a lot of our work's been put online, which makes it pretty impossible to do bird surveys from the computer. So long term, absolutely, we need to monitor what we found. So we've got a survey from before we started developing Deep Creek as a biodiversity hotspot. So we'll do another one, another official one in a couple of years' time. But we also intend to have citizen science through our school groups at the site to monitor birds, particularly frogs at the site. So we're hoping to get the school groups back on site this year. And I know that we had our first schools excursion today, which is really exciting after having 9 months of, I think, everything being online. So that's wonderful.
Yep.
So the next question we've got is that, well, it's more of a comment. So an interesting one, Grevilleans are not for everyone. Some people are actually allergic to them. I did not know that. So that's a good tip. Someone else is saying they think it might be time for them to redo their garden. So they're appreciating all your tips. Thanks, Richard. Someone else is saying, in their humble opinion, we are not building wildlife gardens to attract. We're building it to provide safe passage, like a motel for small birds, where they can come and go as they want. Yep. It could be disheartening when none visit, but it's for the greater good.
Absolutely. And especially if you're the only one doing it, so you become a bit of an oasis amongst the desert. And so that's why we need to encourage more and more people do it, because then there becomes more of these stepping stones so they can eventually hopefully come and travel through your gardens.
Next comment we've got is, too much organic matter though will pollute the soil. The best way is through mulching with arborist mulch, which breaks down. Mulch sold commercially is not ideal. I've had some success with I'd call it bush mulch, so the mixed mulch, and I agree when you have a mixture of organic and that more sort of chip, that works quite well. What have you found, Richard, in terms of a good mulch?
I've used a whole range of mulches. I like a big chunky mulch. I find that fine mulches become more of a barrier, don't let moisture in, and they often don't break down because they don't break down as well. I have been getting recently, I've got contact with a really good arborist, so I'm getting some really good native tree chip mulches, which has a combination of the bark, the wood, the leaves and everything, and so that's a really good option. But you need to make sure you're coming from a really healthy source of trees and not a lot of weed seeds and from exotic plants and so on. So yeah, and I'd avoid some of the more fashionable coloured stained mulches as well. I just don't think that's quite right.
The last question we've got is someone saying that they've got a 5-metre tall dead tree and they're wondering if the council arborist can come and do one of those habitat hollows within it. I said, I think my answer to that would be, unfortunately, no. I know, unfortunately, our arborists are extremely overexpended. So we would have maybe 1 million trees in the Shire, and we're at the point where our hazardous tree budget is well overexpended every single year, particularly with the winds we've had lately in the Shire. So I think in this instance, you probably would have to call one of the local arborists and see if they're willing to trial out this technique on one of your trees, because our rates don't quite stretch enough to cover the trees that we own, let alone private trees, even though it is a worthy cause. Yep. It looks like we've got one more question. Let me just see. Yes, it is a good point. One of our residents has mentioned that we have to be careful around the home in fire-prone areas, as mulch can be a fuel source too.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
We know that we're walking a very fine line with mulch and with shrubs in the Shire, because we do have some particularly fire-prone townships.
Yep, not very good.
That would be about creating those zones for the environment, and then creating a fuel-reduced zone and a buffer around your house to keep you and your assets safe.
Yep, that's right. I've just put up this last slide just to say that next week we're on a Wednesday, and we're doing bees and native bees and butterflies. So
yes, we've tried to alternate between a Tuesday and a Wednesday to see which turns out most popular. So it's good to see the numbers of people that are listening in for each type of session. Thank you.
Very good. So that's pretty much it, I think, Heather, for tonight.
Yes. We'll see some of you next week for a butterflies and bees session, which has turned out to be the most popular session, which is just wonderful news.
Awesome.
So we might end it and say thank you, Richard, for another fabulous informative session. The notes and the recording will be made online if anyone wants to check back in to see any slides they may have missed.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you very much. Thanks, Heather, and I'll hopefully catch you all next week.
Good night, everyone. See ya.
Okay, bye-bye.